To be completely honest with you, I don't feel like this should be remotely controversial, but producing is more important than mixing. And unfortunately, if you were looking at producing or mixing on YouTube, you'd probably get the impression that mixing is more important because the sheer number of mixing videos and tutorials that act like mixing is the end all be all. It's actually incredible. And I cannot tell you how many videos I see that say things like, this EQ trick will fix your mix, or mixing tricks that'll make your music pro, or any other kind of video that essentially makes it sound like that trick is gonna be the difference between an amateur sound or a pro sound. Now, let me be clear. Mixing is extremely important. It's a crucial piece of production. It's required. But my whole point is that there's a wild emphasis on mixing on YouTube in the producer community that I think needs to be addressed. If you hold to the belief that mixing is the most important part of the process, then you are way more likely to also believe that mixing is heavily a corrective process, which means that a big part of mixing is fixing stuff. And the reality is that if you're doing it right, then mixing should be way less about fixing stuff and more about enhancing. In other words, if you are producing properly and emphasizing the production process itself and focusing on getting a great sounding production premix, then the mix process itself is going to be so much more focused on increasing the enjoyability of that track and a lot less about fixing a bunch of things. But a lot of what people talk about on YouTube when it comes to mixing is really about correcting mistakes or fixing problems or how to make something not so great sound pro or any number of things like that, which are ultimately corrective. But if you are heavily focused on creating the best productions and doing that right, then you won't need to be as focused on correction nearly as much because you are dealing with the problems before you even get to the mix. Let me just give you an example. If you are really working on fixing vocals with EQ or compression or any number of plugins that you're trying to fix that, then to me, this is an indicator that you're starting with a vocal that should have probably been executed better, which means you're dealing with a vocal that could have been produced better. So why are you trying to fix a bad vocal when you could have produced it better and not had to deal with that issue in the first place? Now, this is what blows my mind. Somehow people believe that fixing something that's just not that great is easier than getting it to just sound great right away, so you don't have to fix it in the first place because it's not broken. So how would this work? How could you produce a better vocal? Well, if you have a vocal that has a lot of weird tonal resonances that you are then trying to correct or EQ out with narrowband cuts, that tells me that the source was recorded poorly. Now, every situation is going to be different, but in this case, the chances are likely that you're recording in a poor room or also using a mic that does not fit that room or some combination. Now, I know so many home studio producers that have a crappy room with no acoustic treatment, all the while they're using a really sensitive large diaphragm condenser microphone. Well, my friends, that's just a recipe for problems and disaster. No wonder you're having tonal issues in your vocals. So let's get back to the basics and fix that. You can fix that in one of two ways. The first is to simply treat your room. Now, that's the best option because treatment doesn't only help you with recording, but it's going to help you with mixing if you are treating your room with bass trapping materials. And that's going to allow you to essentially also use whatever mic you want because they're all going to sound good because the room is treated. I'm going to treat a room here. I can use any of my microphones and they're all going to sound great here. Now, the second is if you don't have an acoustically treated room, you can use a different mic that's going to work in a subpar environment. Use something like a dynamic mic. This right here is a Shure SM57, or my personal favorite, the one set up behind me. That's the Loudon LS208, which is actually a large diaphragm condenser, but it behaves more similarly to a dynamic mic in terms of how it handles audio. But it's going to have more clarity than a dynamic mic like a Shure SM58 or SM7B. Now, I've literally recorded vocals out of my car with the LS208. It sounds killer. No one's going to know that I wasn't in a studio. That's just one example of focusing on producing better and getting things right at the start. If you're having to fix a ton of problems in your mix, then that's just a major red flag that you probably produced a kind of crappy track. If you're a mixing engineer and you don't have control over what you're working with, then yes, you're gonna have to obviously be more corrective because you can't necessarily control what you get. But for those of you mixing engineers watching, I think you would also agree that mixing a song that is super well produced is 10 times easier than mixing a song that sounds like crap. Right? I thought so. And beyond that, you're simply gonna get better results in the end. This should be common sense. If you have something that sounds bad and you're trying to fix what sounds bad compared to just getting something that sounds awesome, and then you just get to make it sound more awesome, which of those do you think is gonna get better results? I think it's pretty obvious. If you start with something that sounds killer because the production already sounds killer, the mixing engineer's job becomes 10 times easier, and it also becomes significantly less important, as it should be. Look, I get that there's so much out there that elevates the mix process as the most important process, but I can tell you that my friends who mix professionally hate it when they get crappy productions sent to them. It's a nightmare, and I know many of them will actually refuse the work. They're not gonna touch it. They're gonna say, no, sorry, can't help, can't fix that, sayonara. Because the best mixing engineers know that the mixing process should not primarily be corrective. It should be an enhancing process, a process that is taking something that sounds great, making it sound better and more clean. Okay, so how do you produce better? What things can you do that will help you produce better and prepare you for an easier mix? Well, first off, let's just set this to rest here. Professionals don't just know like a million little tips and tricks that you don't. Like, sure, they know some things that you don't. But the thing that makes the biggest difference is that they actually know the fundamentals better than you, and they execute those better than you on a fundamental and basic level. Now, what I mean is they are going to focus on getting great source. What they record is just going to sound great because they understand how to get great recordings and understand great recording techniques. It's not hard, it's not complicated. complicated. Like, recording a vocal is not that difficult, but you have to know the fundamentals to getting it sound great. I have a whole video on that on this channel for free. You have to record at a good level, recording in a good room with the proper mic for the room, and getting killer performances. And this is one of those things that I comment on in the feedback that I give my students a lot. If your performances don't sound professional, then your production will not sound professional, period. Like, I cannot overstate this. If you have insanely good performances on a track, but the mix is subpar, those performances are still going to shine. Those performances will still sound great. There are so many songs out there where the mix is kind of subpar, but the song and the performances and the arrangement, the production are all so good that it doesn't matter. I'm not going to dismiss the fact that a bad mix can ruin a song. A bad mix can definitely ruin a song. I'm not suggesting that it can't. But you have to get great source, right? Proper levels, killer performances, nailing rhythm, right notes, great expression dynamics, all that stuff. This just cannot be oversold. It's one of the most important things you possibly could do. You should be spending a good amount of time making sure your performances are worthy of keeping. If you have amateur performances, sorry, your production's not going to sound professional. No amount of editing or mixing hacks are going to fix that. Again, pros are just nailing the fundamentals, getting those things down. Second, pros are extremely good at sound selection. And this is really difficult to talk about because sound selection is nuanced, and what makes one sound better than another is really difficult to articulate in words. But there's no question that the sounds you choose matter way more than the EQ or compression you choose. If you have poor sound selection, then you are starting in a bad place. You can have great performances, but if you have crappy sound selection, it's not going to matter. Those sounds are going to immediately pull your listener out of that, wow, this is awesome zone, all the way to the, this kind of sounds cheesy, or this just doesn't sound that good. And this is fundamental again. Choosing great sounds is fundamental. It's one of those key parts of producing that if you can't get that right, then you're in big trouble. This is also that when I talk about gear, I promote the idea of spending money on sound libraries above anything else as a producer. You don't need another EQ or a compressor. The ones in your DAW will probably work just fine. If you have 5 EQs but no professional sound libraries, then I'm sorry, that's not going to help you a whole lot unless you're strictly recording live instruments, which if you are strictly recording live instruments, then sound selection still matters because that just means you need to make sure that the instruments you are using actually sound good. Like, you can't use a cheap Rogue acoustic guitar and expect it to sound like an expensive Martin or Taylor. It's not going to happen. Fundamentals. Better sounds equals better production. If you struggle with sound selection, then I recommend you spend time every week exploring sounds. I'm not talking about making music. I'm talking about like 30 minutes of nothing but sound exploration with what you have. Learn where those sounds are, learn what you have, and start identifying what sounds actually sound great and which ones don't. This is something that does require practice. When I got started producing, I didn't have the best choice in sounds, but I practiced, I spent time doing it, and this is something that you can get better. And also, analyze your favorite music. Really pay attention to the sounds you use and try to replicate them. It's a really great exercise to improving in sound selection. The third is arrangement. I talk about this a lot, but if you have great source, great sounds, but your arrangement is not great, then again, it's probably not going to sound very professional. This is also fundamental, by the way. You got to build arrangements that push the song forward. Keep things interesting. Don't stay bland. This is not just throwing everything into arrangement either. It's about making smart decisions about what instruments are doing what every single moment to moment to moment. I just gave feedback to one of my students where he actually had this piano part playing through the whole song. At the beginning, it sounds really cool, right? So it's these nice piano chords, but by about a minute in, or actually even less than a minute in, the piano is still doing that same thing. And as a result, it becomes boring to listen to. There's no change, no variation in what that instrument is doing, no dynamic change, no pattern change, no tension, no release. And it just gets bland. And eventually you start tuning that out. And if there are not other things changing in some way, shape, or form to encourage me to continue listening, it's gonna be really hard for a listener to want to stick around. An arrangement isn't about just throwing in a million things. It's about making smart musical decisions. Somehow the whole producing and mixing process got separated from just being really musical. Like, some of the best advice you could possibly get, be musical. Make music worth listening to. Make interesting arrangements by utilizing dynamics, expression, variation, unique changes in sound over time, varied vocal arrangement, different articulations with instruments. All of that makes music more interesting. The more you know about music, the better of a producer you're gonna be, period. Producing great music is hard, but if you produce great music, then mixing becomes a completely different process than if you're starting with music that does not sound great. If you produce crappy music, then you're gonna struggle to mix those songs to sound professional. But if you emphasize the producing first, nail those fundamentals to get great sounding music before you mix, I promise you, you will be in a better spot to more easily mix the music that you're proud of. I'm starting to live stream where I actually produce live, so you can watch me actually making these decisions every single moment. I just started doing this again. I'm gonna start doing this every single week. If you'd like to get notified when I go live, then text me the word live to 308-248-2058. Live to that number. Text me and I'll make sure we send you reminders when we're going live. See you in the next one.